She stood in front of 30 kids and told my son he didn't deserve the grade he earned. She said it wasn't his work. She said someone else must have done it for him. And when he tried to explain, when he tried to defend himself, she ripped the project right out of his hands and held it up like evidence of a crime he didn't commit. My 12-year-old black son, in front of everyone. I didn't know anything was wrong until I got the call from the school. It was 1:47 in the afternoon. I was in the middle of a meeting, but when I saw the number flash across my screen, my stomach dropped. Schools don't call in the middle of the day unless something's happened. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. It was the vice principal. She said my son, Jordan, had been sent to the office. She said there had been an incident in his science class. She said I needed to come in as soon as possible. I asked her what happened. She paused. Then she said it would be better to discuss it in person. I left work immediately. My hands were shaking the entire drive. Jordan was a good kid, quiet, respectful. He'd never been in trouble before. He loved science. He spent weeks working on his project for the district fair. A water filtration system he designed himself. He researched it. He tested it. He stayed up late perfecting the presentation board. I helped him print the labels, but the work was his, every bit of it. When I got to the school, they led me into a small conference room. Jordan was already sitting there. His eyes were red. His project was on the table in front of him, but something about it looked wrong. The board was crumpled at the edges. One of the diagrams was torn. The vice principal sat across from us. Next to her was Mrs. Calloway, his science teacher, a white woman in her 50s with tight lips and crossed arms. She didn't look at Jordan once. The vice principal spoke first. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said Mrs. Calloway had concerns about the originality of Jordan's project. She said some of the work seemed too advanced for a 7th grader. I looked at Mrs. Calloway. I asked her what she meant. She finally looked at me, not at Jordan, at me. She said she'd been teaching for 23 years. She said she knew what middle school work looked like. And this, she said, gesturing to his project, didn't look like something a student his age could do on his own. I felt my chest tighten. I asked her if she was accusing my son of cheating. She didn't answer directly. She just said she needed to protect the integrity of the classroom. She said other students had worked hard too. She said it wouldn't be fair to give him credit for work that wasn't his. Jordan sat there, silent, his hands folded in his lap, his head down. I asked him to tell me what happened. He didn't look up. He just whispered that she took it. She took his project in front of everyone. I felt my pulse quicken. I felt rage building somewhere deep in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. I turned back to Mrs. Calloway and asked her exactly what happened in her classroom today. Mrs. Calloway didn't even flinch. She said she had every right to question the authenticity of student work. She said she'd seen this before. Parents doing projects for their kids, older siblings, tutors. She said it was her job to make sure the work reflected the student's ability. She said it with such certainty, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed 100 times. I asked her why she assumed Jordan didn't do it himself. She hesitated. Then she said his previous assignments had been average. She said this project was a significant leap. She said it didn't add up. She said it with the kind of finality that made my blood run cold, like she'd already made up her mind weeks ago, and nothing I said would change it. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked her if she questioned every student whose work improved, or just my son. She stiffened, her jaw tightened. She said she wasn't going to be accused of bias. She said she treated all her students the same, but I could see it in her face, the defensiveness, the way she wouldn't look at Jordan, the way she kept saying students like him, without ever defining what that meant. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to ask her what students like him meant, but I knew exactly what she meant. I turned to Jordan. I asked him to explain his project to her, right there, in his own words. He looked up at me. His eyes were glassy. He looked terrified, but he nodded. He started talking, slowly at first. He explained how he got the idea after watching a documentary about the water crisis in Flint. He explained the 3-stage filtration process he designed. He talked about the materials he used, the tests he ran. the adjustments he made when the first version didn't work. He explained the science behind activated charcoal and ceramic filters. He referenced the sources he cited on his board. He talked about how he tested the pH levels after each stage, how he measured the turbidity, how he documented everything in his notebook because he wanted to be thorough. He spoke for 10 minutes. His voice shook, but he knew every single detail. Mrs. Calloway sat there, arms still crossed, face unreadable. She didn't ask a single follow-up question. She didn't acknowledge anything he said. She just sat there like she was waiting for him to finish so she could move on. When he finished, I asked her if she had any more questions. She said it didn't prove anything. She said he could have memorized someone else's work. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked her what it would take to prove it was his. Did she want to see his research notes, his drafts, the photos I took of him building it in our garage? Did she want to see the receipts from the hardware store? The emails he sent himself with ideas at 2 in the morning because he couldn't sleep and was too excited about the project. She said that still wouldn't prove he did it without help. She said parents help their kids all the time and then claim it's the child's work. She said she couldn't just take my word for it. I realized then what was happening. It didn't matter what Jordan said. It didn't matter what I showed her. She had already decided. She had decided the moment she saw a black boy with a project that didn't fit her expectations. She had decided that excellence didn't belong to him, that intelligence was something he must have borrowed or stolen. The vice principal tried to smooth things over. She said maybe they could give Jordan a chance to redo the project under supervision. She said that way there would be no question about the work. She said it with the kind of forced cheerfulness that made me want to throw something. I looked at her. I said my son already did the project. He spent weeks on it. He met every requirement. And now she wanted him to do it again because his teacher didn't believe him. She said it was a compromise. She said it would put everyone's minds at ease. She said Jordan could even use it as an opportunity to improve his grade. I said it was punishment. I said it was humiliation. I said it was telling my son that his word meant nothing, that his work meant nothing, that he had to prove himself twice because once wasn't good enough. Jordan finally spoke. His voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear him. He said it was okay. He said he'd do it again. He just wanted it to be over. But I could see it in his face, the shame, the humiliation, the way he couldn't meet anyone's eyes. I could see him collapsing inward, making himself smaller, trying to disappear. And I wanted to grab him and tell him no. Tell him he didn't have to apologize for being smart. He didn't have to shrink himself to make other people comfortable. But I couldn't say that, not in front of them. I asked him what happened in class. Before I got there, he didn't want to say, but eventually he told me. He said he'd been so proud when he brought the project in that morning. He said Mrs. Calloway asked him to present it first. He went to the front of the room. He set it up on her desk. He started explaining it. He was nervous but excited. He'd practiced his presentation at home. He knew what he wanted to say. She interrupted him. She asked him who helped him. He said he did it himself. She asked again. She said it was okay to admit it. She said she just needed to know the truth. He told her again. He did it himself. His mom helped him print the labels, but the research, the design, the testing, all of it was his. She picked up his project. She looked at it closely. Then she asked the class if they thought a student could really do this kind of work without help. Jordan said the room went silent. He said he looked around and saw some kids staring at him. Some looked uncomfortable. A few shook their heads. One girl in the back row whispered something to her friend, and they both laughed. She said she was disappointed. She said honesty was important. She said if he wasn't going to tell the truth, she couldn't give him credit. Then she put his project aside. She told him to sit down. She moved on to the next student, just like that, like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just destroyed him in front of everyone. Jordan said he sat there for the rest of class, staring at his desk, feeling everyone's eyes on him, feeling like a liar, a cheater, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. He said he wanted to cry, but he didn't. He just sat there frozen, replaying it over and over in his head, wondering what he'd done wrong, wondering if he should have explained it differently, wondering if maybe she was right and somehow he didn't deserve credit for his own work. When the bell rang, he asked her if he could take his project. She said no. She said she needed to hold onto it for review. He said he asked her why she didn't believe him. She said she was just doing her job. I looked at Mrs. Calloway. I asked her if that was true, if that was really what happened. She said she handled it appropriately. She said she gave him a chance to be honest. She said students needed to learn that there are consequences for dishonesty. She said it with such conviction, like she genuinely believed she was teaching him some valuable lesson. I asked her if she realized what she'd done, if she understood that she hadn't just questioned his work. She'd questioned his integrity, his intelligence, his worth, in front of his peers. I asked her if she understood that those kids would go home and tell their parents that Jordan cheated, that he'd walk into school tomorrow and everyone would look at him differently, that she'd branded him a liar and no amount of explaining would erase that. She said I was being dramatic. She said kids are resilient. She said he'd be fine. I asked her if she'd ever done this to a white student, if she'd ever stood in front of a class and accused a white child of cheating without a single shred of evidence, just a gut feeling, just a sense that their work was too good to be theirs. She stood up. She said she didn't have to sit here and be accused of racism. She said she'd been nothing but fair. She said if I had a problem with her teaching, I could take it up with the principal. Then she walked out. Just like that, no apology, no acknowledgement, nothing. The vice principal looked uncomfortable. She said she understood my frustration. She said she'd talk to Mrs. Calloway. She said they'd figure something out. But her voice was hollow. I could tell she was just trying to get me out of there. She didn't want to deal with this. She didn't want to acknowledge what had really happened. But I knew nothing would change. Because this wasn't about the project. It was about what she saw when she looked at my son. It was about the assumptions she made before he even opened his mouth. It was about a system that protects teachers like her and leaves kids like Jordan to fend for themselves. I took Jordan home that day. He didn't say a word the entire drive. When we got inside, he went straight to his room and closed the door. I stood in the hallway. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't know how to make him feel safe again, how to make him believe that his work mattered, that he mattered. I called my husband. He was out of town for work. I told him what happened. He was furious. He said we needed to file a complaint. He said we needed to go to the district. He said we couldn't let this go. He said we needed to fight, but his voice cracked when he said it. I could hear the exhaustion, the fear, the knowledge that fighting meant putting Jordan through even more. But I kept thinking about Jordan, about the look on his face, about how small he seemed sitting in that conference room, about the way he'd offered to redo the project just to make it stop, just to make everyone stop looking at him. I knocked on his door. He didn't answer. I opened it anyway. He was lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, not crying, not moving, just staring. I sat down next to him. I asked him if he was okay. He didn't answer. I told him I was proud of him. I told him his project was incredible. I told him none of this was his fault. I told him Mrs. Calloway was wrong, that she didn't see him, that she didn't see how smart he was, how hard he worked, how much he cared. He turned his head, looked at me. His eyes were filled with something I'd never seen before, something that broke me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was resignation, like he'd learned something about the world that he could never unlearn. He said he didn't want to go back. I asked him what he meant. He said he didn't want to go back to that class. He said he couldn't look at her. He couldn't sit there knowing she thought he was a cheater, knowing the other kids thought it too. He said every time he raised his hand now, people would wonder if his answer was really his. Every time he turned in an assignment, they'd wonder if someone helped him. He said he'd always be the kid who cheated on his science project, even though he didn't. I told him we'd figure it out. I told him we'd talk to the principal. We'd get him moved to a different class. We'd do whatever it took. He said it wouldn't matter. He said everyone already knew. He said even if he proved it was his work, they'd always wonder. There'd always be that doubt. That little voice in the back of their minds saying maybe it wasn't really his. I didn't know what to say, because he was right. The damage was done. You can't undo that kind of public humiliation. You can't take back what was said in front of 30 witnesses. You can't make people unlearn what they think they know about you. The next day, I went back to the school. This time, I met with the principal. I brought copies of everything. Jordan's research notes, his drafts, photos of him working on the project, receipts for the materials we bought. I even brought the documentary he'd watched that inspired the whole thing. I laid it all out on her desk like I was presenting evidence in a trial. Like I was a lawyer defending my son against charges that should never have been brought in the first place. The principal listened. She nodded. She made sympathetic sounds. She said she believed Jordan did the work. She said Mrs. Calloway sometimes got overzealous about academic integrity. She said she meant well. She said she was just trying to maintain standards. I asked her what she was going to do about Mrs. Calloway. She said she'd speak to her. She said she'd remind her about the importance of supporting all students. She said she'd make sure Jordan received the grade he earned. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like she was going above and beyond. I asked if that was it. She said there wasn't much else she could do. She said Mrs. Calloway had been with the district for over 2 decades. She said she'd never had a complaint like this before. She said it with this tone that implied maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Jordan was being too sensitive. Maybe this wasn't really as big of a deal as I was making it. I said maybe that's because no one ever spoke up. Maybe that's because other parents looked at situations like this and decided it wasn't worth the fight. Maybe that's because speaking up meant labeling yourself as difficult, as confrontational, as someone who plays the race card. She said she understood my frustration, but she said teachers had a lot of discretion when it came to grading. She said unless there was clear evidence of discrimination, her hands were tied. She said it was complicated. She said there were procedures. She said she had to be careful about making accusations. I asked her what would count as clear evidence. What would be enough to prove that Mrs. Calloway had treated Jordan differently because of the color of his skin? Did she need to hear her say a slur? Did there need to be a pattern of complaints? How many black kids needed to be humiliated before it counted as discrimination? She didn't have an answer. She just looked at me with this pitying expression, like she felt sorry for me but couldn't help me. Like the system was what it was, and there was nothing she could do to change it. I left that meeting feeling helpless, angry, exhausted, defeated. I'd brought everything. I'd done everything right, and it still wasn't enough. Jordan still had to go back to that classroom. Mrs. Calloway still got to stand at the front of the room and decide who was smart enough, who was honest enough, who deserved to be believed. But the worst part was going home and telling Jordan. Telling him that nothing was really going to change, that Mrs. Calloway would get a talking to, and that would be it. That he'd still have to see her every day, that he'd still have to sit in her class and pretend everything was fine. That he'd have to swallow his hurt and his anger and his humiliation and just keep going because that's what we do. That's what we've always had to do. He took it better than I expected, or maybe he just didn't have any fight left in him. He just nodded, said okay, went back to his room. Over the next few weeks, I watched my son change. He stopped talking about science. He used to come home and tell me about experiments he wanted to try, about theories he'd read about problems he wanted to solve. Now he just did his homework in silence and went to bed. He stopped staying up late working on experiments in the garage. He stopped asking me to take him to the library on weekends. He stopped raising his hand in class. His grades dropped, not because he didn't know the material, but because he stopped trying. He stopped believing that trying mattered. I tried to talk to him about it. He just shrugged, said it didn't matter anyway, said he was fine, but I could see it in his eyes. The light that used to be there was gone, the excitement, the curiosity, the belief that the world was full of possibilities. It had all been replaced with something darker, something sadder, something that no 12-year-old should ever have to carry. I reached out to other parents, quietly, carefully. I asked if their kids had ever had issues with Mrs. Calloway. A few said their kids found her strict. One said her son didn't like her, but no one had stories like ours. No one talked about their kids being accused of cheating, being humiliated, being made to feel like they didn't belong. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't feel safe sharing them. Maybe they were afraid of making waves, of being labeled as difficult, of making things worse for their kids. Maybe they'd learned the same lesson Jordan was learning now, that speaking up doesn't always change things. Sometimes it just makes you a target. I thought about pulling Jordan out of that school, enrolling him somewhere else, starting over, giving him a fresh start where no one knew him as the kid who supposedly cheated. But he said no. He said moving wouldn't change anything. He said it would just prove Mrs. Calloway was right, that he couldn't handle it, that he didn't belong, that he wasn't strong enough to face the consequences of standing out. So we stayed, but something had shifted, not just in Jordan, in me. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way teachers looked at him when I picked him up. The way they spoke to him versus how they spoke to other kids. The way they praised mediocrity in white students but questioned excellence in black ones. The way assumptions were made, low expectations set, potential overlooked, dreams dismissed before they even had a chance to take root. I started wondering how many other black boys were sitting in classrooms right now, being told their work wasn't good enough, that they must have cheated, that they couldn't possibly be that smart. I started thinking about all the Jordans out there who'd learned to stop trying because what was the point? Who'd learned to make themselves smaller because standing out only brought pain. Who'd learned to expect disbelief because that's what the world taught them. I started thinking about all the projects Jordan would never attempt, all the ideas he'd never share, all the risks he'd never take, all the ways he'd learned to protect himself by limiting himself, all the ways he'd learned to make himself smaller, quieter, less threatening, because a white teacher decided his intelligence was suspicious, because his excellence made someone uncomfortable, because he dared to be great in a space that wasn't ready to see him that way. One day Jordan came home and told me Mrs. Calloway had apologized, kind of. She pulled him aside after class. She said she was sorry if he felt singled out. She said she hadn't meant to make him uncomfortable. She said she was just trying to maintain standards. She said it with this tone that made it clear she still believed she'd done the right thing, that she was the victim here, that she was being so gracious by offering this half-hearted apology. He said he told her it was okay, that he understood, that there were no hard feelings. I asked him if it was, if he was really okay. He said no. But what else was he supposed to say? What else was a 12-year-old black boy supposed to say to a white teacher who held his grades, his future, his entire academic reputation in her hands? That night, I lay awake thinking about everything we'd lost. Not just the project, not just the grade, but something deeper, something that couldn't be measured or graded or put on a board. His belief that the world was fair, that hard work mattered, that people would see him for who he was, not what they assumed. That excellence was something he was allowed to claim. That intelligence was his birthright, not something he had to prove over and over again. I thought about how tired I was, how exhausting it was to fight, to advocate, to prove over and over that my son deserved to be believed, to explain racism to people who benefited from pretending it didn't exist, to watch my son learn lessons no child should have to learn, to see him build walls around himself because the world had shown him it wasn't safe to be vulnerable, wasn't safe to be brilliant, wasn't safe to be fully himself, and I thought about how much more exhausting it must be for him to walk into that classroom every day knowing what his teacher thinks of him, knowing that no matter what he does, there will always be doubt, always be questions, always be people who assume his success must be someone else's work. People who can't imagine that a black boy could be that smart, that talented, that driven, that deserving. Jordan's in 8th grade now. He's doing fine, good grades, stays out of trouble, but he's not the same kid he was before that day. He doesn't talk about being a scientist anymore. He doesn't talk about college. He doesn't talk about his dreams. When I ask him what he wants to be when he grows up, he shrugs, says he doesn't know, says it doesn't really matter, says he'll probably just do whatever pays the bills. Mrs. Calloway still teaches at that school. She still has a classroom full of kids. She still gets to decide who's smart enough, who's honest enough, who's worthy of belief. She still gets to shape young minds, to influence futures, to either build up or tear down, and the system protects her, gives her cover, tells her she's doing the right thing by maintaining standards, by questioning excellence when it comes from the wrong kind of student. And Jordan still carries what she did to him. I see it in the way he hesitates before speaking up, in the way he downplays his accomplishments, in the way he's learned to expect disbelief, in the way he makes himself smaller in rooms full of white people, in the way he's learned that excellence makes him a target, that standing out brings scrutiny, that being great means being questioned. I wish I could say we got justice, that things changed, that she faced consequences, that the school district took it seriously, that other teachers learned from what happened, that Jordan got to present his project at the science fair and won an award and got his confidence back. But that's not how this story ends. This is how it ends, with a black boy who learned that even when you do everything right, someone will still find a reason not to believe you. With a child who learned that excellence is suspicious when it comes from someone who looks like him. With a student who learned that the system wasn't built to protect him, to see him, to value him. With a son who learned to stop dreaming because dreams are just another thing that can be taken away. And a mother who has to watch her son shrink himself to fit into a world that was never built for him in the first place. A mother who has to swallow her rage, her grief, her exhaustion, because fighting means putting her son through more, and not fighting means letting him learn that his voice doesn't matter, that his pain doesn't count, that this is just how things are. If you've ever had to fight to prove your child's worth, if you've ever watched someone strip away their confidence with a single accusation, if you've ever felt the exhaustion of being unheard, if you've ever had to explain to your child why the world treats them differently, if you've ever had to watch your baby learn lessons that no child should have to learn, leave a comment. Tell me I'm not alone in this. Tell me your story. Because maybe if enough of us speak up, something will finally change. Maybe if enough of us refuse to stay silent, refuse to make ourselves smaller, refuse to accept that this is just how things are, maybe we can build something different, something better, something where black boys get to be brilliant without being questioned, where excellence is celebrated, not suspected, where our children get to keep their light. Hit subscribe if you want more real stories like this. Stories that don't get told enough. Stories that make people uncomfortable because they're true. Stories that matter because these conversations need to happen. These truths need to be spoken. These children need to be seen.